We're going to be starting some new programs, starting with program 17A, whose name is for time, because we're going to practice writing 4 different for loops. Now, it's come to my attention over looking at the last several programs that some of you don't have a really good grasp on for loops. So let's take a look back and see some of the things that we've learned. So for instance, a simple incremented for loop. First and foremost, I would like to say is that you need to declare, well, you don't have to, but it is really good to declare the loop counter inside the for loop header. So if you're not sure what the for loop header is, that is all of that information. So we're counting by an integer, declare it as an integer there. Whatever we're using as a loop counter variable name, that way we can reuse that in the other loops that you see I'm going to talk about below. All right, a for loop. Let's go back and look at just a few things about for loops. You can count up, you can count down with for loops. So let's go back to our code and talk about the different parts. So basically, this portion from the left parenthesis to the first semicolon is where we initialize and give our loop variable an initial value. Next, we give our loop a terminating condition. And the third and final part of our for loop header is our updating of that variable. So 3 parts: initial value, terminating value, and then updating. In this case, we're just incrementing by 1. So all I want to do in this is just display what that loop counter is, and since we are counting by 1, not starting with 0, if we were starting with 0, then we'd have to make this if statement a little bit more in depth with a little bit more math. But for this case, since we're starting at 1 and we are incrementing by 1, that's an important point. We just take the counter modulus 10. If that is equivalent to 0, then we are displaying 10 numbers across each loop. All right, so let's look and see what happens if we want to increment by something other than 1. Now, I've got a few variables in here, but let's go back to our for loop header. So we have our initial value. I'm just starting it with 1. We have our terminating condition. So we're going to terminate when this expression becomes false, that the value of counter is not less than or equal to 50. Now I'm going to ask the user what you want to increment by, because we don't have to increment by 1. But to do that, I know this variable name is long, but it's very descriptive. The new counter is going to be the old value of the counter plus whatever the incrementing value was. So if the user said they wanted to count by 2s, we're counting by 2s. Count by 3s, count by 4s, count by 5s, whatever the case is. Now, since we don't know what this increment value is, the user is going to supply that. I can't just do a very simple modulus of the counting value. So look at what I've got here. I've created another variable called display counter because I want to guarantee that we're getting 10 numbers across each row. And it's display counter, and I'm initializing that to 1, by the way. It's display counter that we're doing modulus 10 to see if that divides evenly to give us a blank line. And then inside the for loop, we are incrementing display count. So that's inside the for loop. Last line of code inside the for loop. This is just keeping track of how many numbers we're displaying across a line before we get a new line. All right, so the point of this is it's an incremented for loop, but we're incrementing by anything the user wants. And again, I thoroughly recommend you pause this video at any point and take notes. All right, let's look at another particular situation. We want the user to decide what the upper limit is. So we're going to create a variable called upper limit, ask the user to enter that. And since, again, the 3 parts, my initial condition, my terminating condition, that is where upper limit goes. It does not affect the loop counter at all. And in this case, I'm just incrementing by 1. But what I'm going to ask you to do is combine the previous function that I just talked about with this one and ask the user for an increment value and an upper limit both, and you're going to have to do both of them. Alright, so since I'm counting by 1 and starting at 1, I can just display 10 numbers across by using the loop counter variable counter modulus 10 to see if I get 0. Now, so far I hope you've noticed that in the 3 for loops that I've been talking about so far, I'm using the same variable name for the loop counter called counter. And that is because I'm declaring them inside the loop header, which means the variable counter is only known inside the left and right curly brackets of that for loop. It is not known anywhere else in the program. That's called scope of the variable. And so this has a block scope. Counter only exists in between those left and right curly brackets. Alright, now here's the one that some of you have been having trouble with, so let's take a look at this. Okay, the way some of you honestly wrote the palindrome program is you didn't count backwards. The directions said to have a for loop count backwards. So I'm bringing this to your attention now because I did not take points off of the palindrome, but I will be taking points off the next program. The majority of you had a for loop that incremented. We need to learn how to decrement, subtract. So we have our initial value. When we're counting backwards, we start with something larger. We count backwards. We, in our terminating condition, stop at something smaller. And just to compare and contrast, quickly I'll show this one. Every one of these that we've had so far have been less than or equal to because we've been incrementing. But when we decrement, that becomes greater than or equal to, depending on your application. And then the last thing we have to do is decrement, and in this case we're just subtracting 1. However, I am asking you, in the program that you're going to be writing, you're going to ask the user for a starting value, an ending value, and an incrementing value. So you're going to have to do a little trick like we did with this display counter to keep track of how many numbers you're displaying across each line in your output. Alright, so back to decrement. If your program does not have a for loop header that counts backwards, you will not get credit for that. Now what's up with this if statement? Well, 50, divided by 10 is 0. So I wanted to throw that off by 1, so I would get 10 numbers across the first row. Alright, so there's a look. Hopefully you've paused the video, written down what you need to. You can certainly back up the video, replay it. You're going to be practicing for loops in program 17A, 2 of which are decrementing if your loop counter does not count backwards. You will not get the points for that. So it's time for us to practice that and learn that. Alright, so again, for loops can count backwards, which is called decrementing. So you start with a larger number, end with a smaller number, and subtract. That was Chapter 6 PowerPoint, by the way, slide 16. So back to our program. Pretty much it's self-explanatory. Just read it carefully. I've got everything spelled out. You're going to have a menu. So we're going to do a menu for each of these for loops, an incremented for loop. And we're going to generate some capital letters. We're going to generate some lowercase letters. We're going to count backwards, asking the user for some parameters. So let me get more specific about that when we get to step number 11 here. All right, so what I would like to do, get all those words across the screen. All right, we're going to ask the user for an increment value and an upper limit. So we're going to count upwards, whatever the user wants to increment by, and whatever that upper limit is. And as I showed in the examples, you're going to need a counter that is not in the loop header, but a counter that allows us to display 10 numbers across each row. All right, make sure that you say for left parentheses int in the name of your loop counter variable. That's what we want to do. So that should be straightforward. Let's look at the second part of this, generating capital letters. Wait, what? All right, your for loop is going to start with a value of 65, which is ASCII code for capital A. It's going to terminate at an upper limit of 90, which is ASCII code for capital Z. And of course, we want to increment by 1 to go through all the letters of the alphabet, A through Z. We want 10 letters across each row, so yes, you're going to have that counter to count how many letters you're displaying. Right? Use a set with 5 for all of these functions, for all of these for loops. And just so you remember, back in Chapter 3, in the Chapter 3 PowerPoint, we talked about typecasting. We talked about implicit versus explicit. So here in bold, I want you to explicitly typecast those integers that are in the for loop to a char. And there's your hint right there, char. But take a look at the Chapter 3 PowerPoint toward the end. That'll help you. All right, and then we're going to do something similar to that. We're going to count backwards. So the next two functions are going to be having for loops that count backwards. So we're going to have a for loop that starts at 122, which is ASCII code for lowercase z, stops at 97, which is ASCII code for lowercase a, and we're going to decrement or subtract by 1 every time we go through that for loop. We want 10 letters in this case, across each row. And again, explicitly typecast. But again, if your for loop header is not decrementing, you lose the points for this function in this portion of the program. So many of you, in your palindrome, you had a for loop that was incrementing, and then you took the length of the word and you subtracted 1 every time you went through the loop. Don't do anything like that in this case, or you won't get the points. We're practicing for loops. All right, and then the last for loop we're practicing is counting down. So we're going to ask the user what they want to decrement by. Translation, what do you want to subtract by? What's your starting value? What is your ending value? And all of these variables should be local to this function. For all 4 of these functions, you should not be passing any of these variables from function to function. All right, so you're going to display 10 numbers across each row. So yes, you're going to need a display numbers counter like I illustrated in the sample code, because you're going to keep track of how many numbers are displaying across each row before you move to the next row. Again, your for loop header must decrement. Make it count backwards. All right, there's 2 other programs in this section for 17, but I want to get you started on 17A for now.